Well, welcome. Welcome to Straight Talk. I am Senator Gerald Neal, and I have as my special guest today, Attorney Lonita Baker. I should advise you that we're using the Zoom platform and streaming through Facebook. And we're simultaneously being aired over WLOU radio. I would request that each of you viewing share this event to your contacts and friends and ask them to do the same. So we want to get the largest reach that we possibly can. Again, I have as my guest Lonita Baker, who's a distinguished attorney here in Louisville, Kentucky, who's involved in a lot of efforts and is a national leader, in fact, in terms of her involvement with national attorney groups and probably a number of groups that I don't know. I'll allow her to address that. But let me sort of frame this. First of all, welcome, Lonita.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, let me frame this. So as policing has militarized to fighting a faltering war on drugs, few tactics have proved as dangerous as the use of forcible entry raids to serve narcotic search warrants. These practices have become commonplace over the last quarter century and into the 21st century. And the Supreme Court has basically eroded much of our Fourth Amendment protections regarding unreasonable searches and seizures. So it's made it more easy for these things to happen. But the casualties have occurred in the execution of, in particular, no-knock warrants, which give police prior judicial authority to force entry without notice. It should be noted that the drug crimes used to justify so many raids are not capital offenses, but they often end in death. So today we're going to talk about that, particularly in light of the tragic death of Breonna Taylor. And we're fortunate to have you here today to get your perspective on things. So I just wanted to approach it from this standpoint. Could you give us the basic facts as you understand them that you can share with us?
Yes, on March 13th, the early morning of March 13th, about 12:30 to 1 in the morning, members of Louisville Metro Police Department Criminal Interdiction Unit entered into my client Breonna Taylor's apartment on Springfield Drive. They banged in the door. They did not announce themselves, and that's what we've maintained this entire time. That's what the tape played by Commonwealth Attorney Tom Wine, that Kenny Walker still maintained that they never announced that it was police. And if it was police, they would have opened the door. But Kenny and Breonna thought that someone was trying to invade their home. Someone was trying to burglarize their home. And when the door flew open, Kenny fired a shot at unknown to him police officers. In exchange, police officers returned 20 to 30 rounds. So shots into the apartment. Some of those bullets went into an upstairs apartment. Some went into a neighboring apartment where a 5-year-old child and his mother slept. Went straight through their apartment, out their patio door as well. We know from an investigation of the scene. At least eight bullets hit Breonna Taylor, killing her, at the scene. And this search warrant was part of a larger narcotics investigation. What we've since learned is that information contained in this search warrant specifically for Breonna's apartment was not accurate. There was some information saying that they had received that officers, the affiant officer, so the officer that swore out the affidavit, confirmed with the postal inspector that numerous packages had been sent to Breonna's apartment for for one of the primary targets of the search warrant. However, we since learned from the postal inspector that that is not the case, that LMPD had not asked, and that the one agency that did an inquiry on that address, they were informed that there was no suspicious activity at her address. Even with that, the allegations contained in that search warrant were 2 months prior to when she was killed. So it was old information and uncorroborated information. So with all of everything that we've seen thus far, Breonna should still be here today. There's no reason she should be here today. There was no reason that Kenny Walker should have been facing, with Kentucky having a castle doctrine, you have a right to protect your home from intruders. He should not have been facing an attempted murder charge for 2 months, as we know, was dropped yesterday. Also, knowing that there's a possibility that it could be brought back according to Commonwealth Attorney timeline.
Well, let's back up a little bit. Tell us a little bit about who Breonna Taylor was.
Yes, Breonna Taylor is a 26-year-old young lady. She was very much family-oriented young lady. Her younger sister lived with her. Thankfully, her younger sister was out of town the night that this happened. So it wasn't more tragic than it already is. She worked as a ER tech at both Norton and University Hospital. She had a certified EMT record. She was the future of Louisville. She was 26-year-old. She is everything that we want our future to be, a hardworking young lady, working, 2 jobs, taking care of herself, family members. She loved family get-together. She was just a positive person from everyone that we've talked to.
And I understand that there was a young man, her boyfriend, I assume, that was there at the time of this. And tell us about this. I understand there were charges against him. What can you tell us about this young man? I believe his name is Kenneth Walker.
Kenneth Walker, he and Breonna have known each other since high school. They've dated on and off since high school. Very positive young man from everything that I've heard. He was protecting his home. He was a licensed gun owner. And when someone's banging in their door, he did what the man of the house is supposed to do and was protecting his home. And for that, he was facing an attempted murder charge of a police officer, because I don't know if people know, anytime you shoot at police officers, it warrants a charge of attempted murder. So he was facing that charge. As we know, yesterday, timeline dismissed the indictment, but said, if the independent investigation warrants that it be represented, that he would be representing it. So, but he was set to begin a job at the United States Postal Service. He was unable to start that job because he was in custody at the time that he was supposed to do his orientation. So, another young man doing what he was supposed to do, working to take care of himself, and stopped short of that because he had he was on home incarceration in custody at first, and then released to home incarceration for 2 months. So,
I think it should be noted, you can correct me if I'm inaccurate about this. They had, when Tom Wine, the Commonwealth Attorney, dropped this, they had already completed an exhaustive investigation by the police department itself, did they not?
I believe that it was completed. The Public Integrity Unit turned the results of their investigation over to the Attorney General's office. It is my understanding that the Attorney General's office does intend to do further investigation and not just accepting the investigation that's already been complete. So there is still more investigation to be complete, but LMPD, yes, it is my understanding, completed their Public Integrity Unit investigation.
So it looks like there are 3 investigations at least that will take place. There's the one done by the police Public Integrity Unit, the one that is now slated for the Attorney General, the Kentucky Attorney General Cameron, to conduct. And then there's a federal investigation that's been publicly announced that I believe they said they would do a thorough review and investigation. Is that correct? More than a review?
More than a review, yes.
Yeah. Well, that's significant that this attention has been brought to this case. Is what's unusual, and a lot of people have asked a question. It says, this happened, what, over 2 months ago?
Yeah, March 13th.
March 13th, yet it only became public recently. What are the factors that you are aware of, or what you understand as to why this became public in such a delayed fashion?
One, I will say this took place right at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So as we were transitioning into our stay-at-home orders, and that taking effect, I was retained by the family, during that first week. So luckily, myself and my other co-counsel, Sam Aguiar, we did get to do some investigation prior to being on complete shutdown. We filed our civil suit actually in April. And then, Sam and I made the decision, to ask our client if she would be willing for us to reach out to my friend Benjamin Crump, who has a lot of history with civil rights cases, if she would be willing for us to bring him into the case so that he could help bring the much needed attention that this case needed, deserved, on behalf of justice for Breonna, but also to bring about much needed change that is needed within the way we are currently, our police department is currently policing, and the family was in favor of that. They know that there's reform that's needed, and so they were okay with that. And so we brought Ben in, and that did help tremendously bring the attention that was needed.
Well, I think we all can confirm that because you see it on national news every day. It's brought to the attention of national political figures and other individuals that have commented on this particular piece, national TV and that sort of thing. So what effect, if any, do you think that's brought to this case?
I think it's brought a lot. I think it's forced people to actually move. They can't sit still and let the investigation ride out the way that they typically do, because just from prior instances, we know that these investigations take forever. We know that with the number of incidents that we've had over the past few years with the police department, whether it goes back to the Explore youth program, sex abuse cases, to the stop and frisk that was going on last year, to now this, as well as other issues, that needed to bring about much needed change. We now see that Chief Conrad is retiring. I think that the attention did force that on. I think that getting the Attorney General's office involved was brought about by the attention. I'm not sure. I'm happy that Tom Wine recused himself from the officer's case, but we've seen in the past where he's not recused himself necessarily from police shootings. I do think that the independent investigations, I've always said that in any regard, not just Louisville Metro Police Department, but with any police department, should always be an outside agency investigating use of force complaints and determining whether excessive force was used, and a separate prosecuting agency. I just don't see where it can be effective in prosecutors that you work with day in and day out are asked to prosecute officers that they also need to move forth other cases that they have within their office. So I've always felt strongly about needing outside prosecuting offices pursuing these type of cases. So,
I would go on to make the observation that national attention also informed people locally.
yes,
And activated a number of individuals and groups to focus on this because of the outrage that was expressed in reaction to it. But there's this question as to whether or not there's some additional facts out there or something of this nature. From your perspective, what is it that's not known I'm talking about on any side of it, on the police side or whatever that's out there, that may be resolved with additional information that will have some impact on this.
Well, they have, the police have way more information than I have, just because they investigated it at that time. One thing that we still not heard and we would love to hear is the 911 tape. We do know that Mr. Walker called 911. We do know from his phone records that phone call was at least 3 minutes long. So I think yesterday it was referred to as he called and hung up, but from the phone records, it looks to have been at least 3 minutes long. So we would love to get that. We heard portions of Mr. Walker's and Officer Mattingly's statements yesterday. I would love to hear all of the officer involved statements. I think yesterday was the first time that I had the opportunity to see and hear what other officers were involved. And when I say involved, just at the scene. So not saying that they necessarily shot or you know, I don't know the level of their involvement, but that they were at the scene. So I will be happy to get that information that we've not been able to get, because it is, you know, just in dealing, like whenever requesting public integrity files, it's, if the investigation's ongoing, you don't get it because it could apparently impact the outcome of the investigation.
All right. Well, from your perspective, from what you know, what do you see as the obvious deficiencies based upon what you know? I
think definitely no-knock warrants in general. I think no-knock warrants are incompatible with the Castle Doctrine. I think no-knock warrants are not only dangerous, like in this case, it's Breonna that is deceased, but an officer was shot. We know from other cases in other states that no-knock warrants are just inherently dangerous. So I think that's a deficiency, one, and they should not be used. I go as far as to say they should not be used in any narcotics investigation. The risk associated with them just don't justify, are just not justified by apprehending people who are trafficking narcotics. I think that they should be reserved solely for violent offenders. And when I say violent offenders, murderers, serial killers, suspected terrorists, and kidnappers. I don't know that outside of those situations that no-knock warrant, that I would ever see a situation where we should put officers at risk or citizens at risk. We've seen prior no-knock warrants where babies have been, like one of the flash bombs went into a crib and burned the entire side of the face side of face and body of an infant in their crib. Like, we can't have that. And that was off of a false information from an informant. And I think more scrutiny needs to be paid to search warrants. We see a lot of cutting and pasting, even in the 5 warrants in this case. The majority of those warrants are cut and paste from each other. We have to give more scrutiny to when we're filling out those affidavits to that.
Well, let's talk about that. What many people may not know what a no-knock warrant is, although it seems like it would be obvious. But also why no-knock warrants are requested.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Under LMPD and what the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled is that no-knock warrants can be permissible if they believe, one, that evidence may be destroyed, a defendant or suspect may flee, or that it's danger. There's a danger to the police officers if they announce themselves. I think the danger is the other way. But in this one, it was cut and paste that because of the history of, again, the primary targets of this search warrant. And when you look, if you read the 5 warrants were involved with this investigation, on the other 4, it's 6 people that are listed on all 4 of those. Breonna Taylor's name is not on any of those. The only one that her name shows up on is the one for her apartment. But you have 6 people listed on 4 out of 5 warrants. They all did have pending criminal offenses, criminal charges related to narcotics. And they said that, based on their history of fleeing and destroying evidence is why they sought the no-knock warrant. None of those facts had anything to do with Breonna's apartment. Yet that same paragraph was cut and pasted onto that search warrant, and it was signed by the judge. On the other search warrants, they had more recent information, more recent investigation. Then again, in Breonna's, all the allegations that were included were from January. And again, some of the information the postal inspectors specifically denied. So there was nothing to justify a no-knock warrant in Breonna's case. Again, she had no criminal record whatsoever. And Kenny Walker either. So, and Kenny Walker is not listed on any warrant because the investigation didn't even show they didn't mention any of his name, never saw Kenny. They didn't know Kenny was at the house. So that's again going to show how it didn't even mention that Breonna's sister lived there. So that just shows how much her apartment was not investigated or surveilled before that search warrant was requested.
And this screams out questions that need to be answered. There's no question about that. I mean, just listening to this and what's been reported publicly, we have the situation where we have a postal inspector or the U.S. Inspector General, whatever that name is, who denies that there was anything suspicious as far as they knew, unless some independent outside postal inspector did that, which would be unusual and not normally done. But no knowledge that he had. So, but the information that was in the warrant seemed to be in conflict with that. That's one. Mm-hmm. Then two, there's in taking the warrant, surely there has to be some levels of oversight, I would assume, levels of oversight in those situations. I mean, certainly you wouldn't have a component of the police department in terms of itself doing that sort of thing. I don't know whether it is or not, but I don't have any suggestion otherwise that something else, some oversight or significant oversight, because particularly given the history of no-knock warrants. And then three, I keep thinking about who signed off on this warrant, Judge. What, and I don't want to be accusatory because I don't know, I don't have the facts. Yeah. And we're going to wait for those. But I'm wondering what judges do, and I'm generalizing here. Yeah. What the judges do and to what extent do they take this? Because judges I know are pretty serious. They're pretty thorough. I have the highest respect for the judges, and particularly in the circuit. I have to say that. But it leaves a lot of unanswered questions.
It does. And my hope is that with this incident, that judges give a little bit more scrutiny to these warrants before just signing off on them. So I hope that and there are already some judges who do scrutinize warrants before signing. And there are some judges that will not sign everything that's put in front of them. So my hope is that, this incident, the Breonna's, her family definitely does not want her death to be in vain. And if one thing that came out of this, and there's several things that we want to come out of this, which we talked about, the elimination of no-knock warrants, that's definitely, at the top of the list. But if it's also that judges give a little bit more scrutiny before signing off on these warrants and ask a little bit more questions before signing off on these warrants. And if they start to notice the same language popping up in every warrant that they add, they give, it gives them some pause that that is my hope that this case does that. The other thing we want to see definitely in terms of police reform, and I know there's been some standard operating procedure updates, in the last couple of days, in that search warrants, 100% of search warrants need to have body camera, video footage recorded, however you want to record it. They should.
Now you're referencing something with what, the Louisville Police Department or somewhere else?
Louisville Metro Police Department updated its SOPs in the last few days.
Okay. Well, again, I'm wondering what the standards are. It raises questions as to, what struck me, the little information that I've received, I guess it's the same information the public has received generally, is what appears to be a lack of adequate standards, procedural standards in place. Now think about this now. I just reported, and my research has indicated that this whole thing about no knocks and other warrants have been increased significantly over the last quarter of the previous century, and now we're a quarter almost into this century. Yet, this is a major police department, and I'm not just talking about this police department. I'm talking about across the country, and I guess it's different with different, police. Yeah. It's amazing to me that standards, careful standards, because let me tell you something. Police work is dangerous.
It is.
It's necessary.
Yep.
The training is great training because great responsibility is placed there. And on the other side of that, you would think that there would be these procedural safeguards at every step of the way, because on the other side of that is the public.
Yeah.
Your take?
I agree 100% with you. And one thing, that I've talked to you about, I've talked to, other people in the state house about, I talked to local people about, we talked about it at the public safety committee meeting. I wanted to go a step further than just standard operating procedures within the police department, because those can be changed on a whim. I would like to see legislation take place as it relates to no-knock warrant. As it stands now, and I think, in your research too, Oregon is the only state that has a law banning no-knock warrants. And Florida has a Supreme Court ruling that bans no-knock warrants. I would like for the state of Kentucky, and until you guys get in to meet in that next session, I would like the Metro Council to enact an ordinance banning no-knock warrants, except in the case of situations like I referenced earlier, suspected murderers, kidnappers, terrorists. Again, I don't think narcotic investigations justify the risk associated with no-knock warrants.
I'm sure others are looking into this. I will say that I certainly am looking into this, and the research is ongoing, and the intention is to take or present some legislative action to be considered, because we're not just talking about Louisville, we're talking about law enforcement across the Commonwealth. Right. And there have to be standards and understanding. So this is an area it may be a little complex than you think, at least my research shows me that, but the fact of the matter, obviously, there has to be action in this regard, and I do plan to pre-file some legislation regarding that. But let me broaden this a little bit, and I think we're there, because what we're really talking about and what this really tees up is the broader context of no-knock warrants. This tees up the questions, and some of which have not been asked, and many that have not been answered. But we're really talking about how we do policing. And we're talking about the relationship of the police department and community. And we all know, since the early commentators on police and community have said, good law enforcement is based upon trust and the acceptance and the validity that the police department has with its community. It's just essential that happens, and this tends to erode it. what do you think additional? I mean, for instance, body cameras. What do you think about those in terms of having that?
Yeah, I think body cameras are a good thing. I was still at the prosecutor's office, the county attorney's office, when Louisville Metro first started implementing the use of body cameras. And I will tell you, as a prosecutor, I loved it because it took away the he said, she said. I think to an extent, what happened is people started to see it's not always it's not always black and white, and it's not always the way that it's presented by the involved officers. And so it held them to another level of accountability. You had to be straightforward, you had to be forthcoming. So I loved it as a tool for prosecution because, as a prosecutor, my job was not just to get convictions, but it was to effectuate justice. So if there was a case that I needed to dismiss because the body camera didn't show or didn't justify continuing to prosecute that case, I had the evidence right there to do so, and do so with certainty that that was the right thing to do, right? You can't just prosecute something that does not meet the statutes, or that justice doesn't call you to continue prosecuting it. However, on the flip side, it also, when the police officers were right, is he's like, hey, here's the body camera footage to show.
Them. Yeah.
So it made the body cameras make the justice system or hold the justice system accountable to do what the justice system is supposed to do. And so I like body cameras.
Yeah. Well, certainly if there were body cameras in this particular event, it would take care of that issue as to whether, notwithstanding the fact that they had a no-knock warrant, whether or not they knocked or apprised the folks inside that they were announcing themselves, which they say they did.
They say they did. Mr. Walker said they did not. We've also talked to at least 6 neighbors who said that they did not announce themselves.
Yeah. Body camera could have cleared that up.
I say they did not announce themselves. Right. And I say the knocking was probably the banging of the ram, because we know that the ram usually doesn't get in right away. So the knocking was probably the banging of the ram, which is what prompted, as Mr. Walker described yesterday, Breonna, to say, keep asking who is it, and they're not getting anything on the other end. From talking to neighbors, the walls are thin. You would, if they had said police, they would have heard it. And they just did not hear anyone say that it was police. So.
Yeah. Well, there's an argument by some. I think I think it's 89% in the last research that was done, that the public supports the cameras on officers. They're very strong.
Yeah, it helps build that trust that's needed, and it helps hold everyone accountable. The public, it protects officers. So people can't say, oh, they're deporting me, they're just harassing me. It protects everyone involved. So there's no real reason not to have, I understand in those certain situations where you have undercover officers. I will say, in my experience in working as a prosecutor, I don't know that officers with undercover necessarily, maybe surveillance, and I can get the surveillance aspect, but they usually have another type of camera for surveillance. LMPD uses CIs more than putting officers actually undercover,
A CI.
Confidential informant.
Yeah. Well, this is very interesting. The camera, the use of the cameras. I understand that a big argument against them is the cost. There's a significant cost that we're saying, but who's going to handle it? You got small police departments that may say, hey, our budget can't handle this. You have a major police department, and our money now, particularly at this moment in time, I think is strained. The city budget, the state budget, everything's strained. But that doesn't mean we can't plan for and get to a comprehensive situation if that becomes a priority.
I agree, and I would counter that by saying, long term, does it cost more to get the body cameras or more to defend or pay out on lawsuits?
And much has been paid on lawsuits. Let me, with respect to the castle doctrine, you mentioned that earlier. Could you expand on what that is, for instance?
Basically, in Kentucky, the castle doctrine is says that a person has a right to defend their home from intruders. There is an exception if and defend their home by, and you can use deadly force if necessary. So there is an exception if you know that the person trying to enter the home is law enforcement. So I think that's part of why you know that the stance of the LMPD is that they announce themselves, but I just can't discount the testimony of at least 6 neighbors who have nothing to gain by saying, no, they did not announce themselves. So,
well, in my understanding, in Kentucky, the castle doctrine extends to an automobile as well.
yes.
But also the standard that's required is different to establish intent. For instance, that it's a lower standard under the castle doctrine as opposed to establishing probable cause beyond a reasonable doubt, for instance. So in establishing that. So anyway, there's a conflict there. There's an obvious conflict, and I guess that's the somewhere in between Kenneth Walker being charged and the prosecution stepping back from that, and from that charge is in the whole rationality between castle doctrine and the standard way of proving yourself when you use deadly force. State law. Let's talk about state law a little bit. That's what I do. I'm just going to tee up some things. I just want to get your opinion on them with respect to them. Officers, should they need probable cause, or at least, well, let's say, should they need probable cause to get a warrant? Do you think that's the ideal or the best situation as opposed to reasonable suspicion?
Probable cause is definitely higher than reasonable suspicion. So I would say probable cause to get you should need probable cause to get a warrant.
And I would suggest to you that that's going to be a bone of contention from the officer side in terms of how they would think they would have to do their work. And that's a discussion area. I don't have enough expertise.
Well, I thought the standard to get a warrant is probable cause. Is it not already probable cause?
Well, I think it's reasonable suspicion. And maybe I'm wrong. You know more about it than I do. I don't do the criminal law stuff, so I'm gonna go with you. Okay. Here's another one. No forcible entry warrant may be authorized solely on an allegation of possession or use of prohibited drugs or drug paraphernalia. That, in other words, you can't use that for a basis unless you can show there's some kind of safety factor. Now, I'm talking specifically about drugs.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's your thinking there?
Of no search warrant or no warrant? No, not warrant.
No forcible entry.
No forcible entry.
That's any warrant.
I think if you're saying for any warrant, I think that would be a point of contention. If they have to announce themselves, I'm not anti that your clause.
Okay. Uniforms must be worn with conspicuous lettering and insignia, so those who are undertaking these forcible entries are easily identifiable, at least at a blink of an eye.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that, but I think that, like in this case, they didn't see the officer. So in some instances, if you're not able to see who they are, then that doesn't necessarily alleviate the issue of the safety issue.
But in many cases, they do see them.
Yeah.
And
I think they should have it. Yes, they should definitely be marked. I was just saying that doesn't alleviate those situations. Yeah.
Body cameras shall be worn on each officer during the entire event on forcible entries. And I'm talking about all officers involved.
They should be, because you get different angles.
Yeah. Any evidence? I'm trying to think, how do you enforce something like this? Because you can say this, but someone can turn off the camera. I mean, there's all kinds of judgments that can be made at the scene, and there are many instances where they're not required to turn those cameras on, or they may be required, they turn the cameras off. So what about in law? Any evidence obtained in violation of the law, which would be established, including the restrictions created, should become inadmissible in court. That takes away the incentive to turn it off to get what you're after.
Well, and I think that, so because of the climate we're in, and people do have a distrust of officers, I'm a person that believes most officers are great people and are not dishonest.
I agree with that.
It's the few rotten apples that that make the headway, but there is a lot of distrust in communities and in the country. And so as a former prosecutor, I want as much stuff on video as I can get on video to make my case easier if I have to present it to a jury. We're not in a situation where, as it used to be, where you could just, it's the defendant's word against the officer's word, and the jury just sides with the officer. We don't live in those times anymore.
Yeah. But let me just say, though, that if it's inadmissible in court, do you believe that would take away the incentive to turn off a camera?
Yes.
I'm just testing it.
Yeah.
Should there be a standard established and requirements for policy in each agency? What I'm talking about is a requirement for law enforcement agencies to have a standard across the board, because there is a discussion that you can't micromanage every situation. It is different in different environments, different cultures that they work within, smaller rural settings and so forth. But should there not be a standard that each one of them meets at some level?
Yes, and you have to have a method for monitoring when those standards are not being adhered to, because that's what we've come across. LMPD has its standard operating procedures, but what we come to find is that a lot of them aren't necessarily being followed. So one being, it's been in their SOPs that search warrants are recorded from start to finish. That seems to be more the exception than the rule, but the rule says to record it. So
in my research, I was looking at, what are the problem areas that come up, in these sort of things. So in these general areas, it'd be interesting to get your take on this. Inadequate judicial scrutiny. And I think we hit on that a little bit earlier as a major concern. I think you've already commented on that. I won't go with that. This falls into maybe oversight questions, or the standards that are established. Wrong addresses seems to be serious problems with respect to these things. But in this particular case, something unusual happened. Maybe it's unusual, I really don't know, is that the central figure in all of this, had been arrested at the time they were serving this warrant.
yeah.
Where was the communication? It raised a question in my mind. I can understand. I mean, maybe this was within a short time period, but it would seem that if somebody has a warrant out there and they know that there's somebody somewhere should be notified in this process. It just seems that way to me. What's your take? I think we got a little freeze in this particular technical difficulty here. Maybe we can get her back straight up. The question basically is this, is that if in fact if in fact you have a situation where an individual is being arrested and they're serving a warrant, then obviously it is important for that individual, if some element of the case, the central element of the case is they're being acted upon by law enforcement, should there not be some kind of linkage between those individuals and those who are executing the warrants? I'm just thinking about what is the communication, what is the preparation, what are the lines of procedures that are in place for correct communication to take place. So that's going to be important in much of this. And then you have this piece in many situations, you know, officers, like I said earlier, and I think we all agree, are in a situation where they do a lot of dangerous tasks, and certainly they have to take precautions. But it would appear to me also that the policies that protect both ways and enables them to do their job, and particularly protect them in these situations, also there's a duty to protect those who they're dealing with. For instance, if someone's dealing in a non-capital offense type of circumstance, certainly you don't want a situation with an outcome where somebody ends up dead as a result of this particular piece. So it's very important to make sure that that happens. And then the lack of monitoring, which gets into this question of oversight. That's a very important thing. The oversight is necessary. So it's important for us to know how we're going to approach this particular thing. So I think we have Lonita back. We got over some of the technical difficulties. Welcome back. I was making comment on this monitoring piece, the lack of oversight. To me, that seems to be a very crucial element of what we're talking about here. What's your perspective on that?
I think the lack of oversight is one of the big issues. As I said before, we have the LMPD had standard operating procedures that we know were not being followed. And so I think the oversight from a level of commanding officers, I think oversight from our judicial system, our judges are the gatekeeper in these situations. So they have to take that position seriously and in hopes that this won't happen. But also, that's why I say at some point, I think if we're not following procedures, we have to implement those laws for the safety of all of our citizens and our law enforcement officers.
So let's talk about justice a little bit. How do you perceive or define justice in this given situation? Or how do you define justice generally? How do you see this in the context of our society, in the context of this event?
Justice is, the justice system is built on rehabilitation, I guess. Are we going to that level, or justice in general?
Well, let's talk about both of them. Let's say in a specific situation, let's talk about the victim. Okay. Justice for the victim. What does that mean?
Yeah. So justice for, I guess still criminal or kind of this civil setting.
In criminal in this sense.
In criminal. So in this setting, you mean?
Well, let me. I'm probably not framing the question well, so I apologize for that. I guess what I'm trying to get into, you hear people say, "I want justice." What does that mean in what given situation? You have a sense of it, but what does it mean? For instance, in my mind, let's say in a case of someone who's lost their life somewhere, what does justice mean to the family? What does it mean to the community? In my mind, I can express it. I just wondered what you thought about it.
So primarily, if a death was brought about due to some, as we talked about earlier, deficiency, that part of justice in that situation means to bring about much needed change to eliminate those deficiencies, to rectify those deficiencies. And that's one thing that we want to do here, so that it doesn't happen to other individuals. So we want to prevent this from happening, the same situation from happening to people in the future.
And I'm glad you said that, because some people will say what's happened, you can't bring someone back that's lost their life. So what is the use of going forward and pressing on these issues that are the subject matter of this interview right here, as an example? But that is exactly goes back to a statement you made early in the interview, so that her life not be
Taken
lived
in
in vain.
vain.
Yeah, I can see that. Then there's a broader context, the societal justice. What does it mean? There are people out here that haven't even heard of this.
Mhm.
I doubt there's very few. That's not touched by this, does not live in this reality, doesn't know anyone that's been affected in this way, yet they're part of this system. What does justice to you means in this context?
Well, to people in those situations, Breonna didn't live in this context, So most of us don't live in that world until it happens to us. And then after it happens to us, it's too late. And so I say to people who think that, oh, this couldn't happen to me, it can. And let's make it to where it won't. And that's our goal. So
well, I have to say that that's very well said, because I think some people feel disconnected from an event. We live in a societal context. What happens at one end of it or in some aspect of it affects us all. And sometimes we don't feel it.
Yeah.
But in very real ways, it changes how we live and how we relate to each other. So this is very important, what has happened here. I have to say that I really appreciate, I know you well, I appreciate the work that I know that you've undertaken. I particularly appreciate the leadership that I've seen you exhibit time and time again and continue to exhibit. I wish you well in your effort here. I know that you're going to do everything that you can, and I know. And the other thing I know about you is that you're gonna do the right thing.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that. On the other side of that piece, and maybe it should not be on the other side, I think it's important for folks to understand and put things into context. We need a good relationship between those who are sworn to serve and protect in our community.
100% agree.
And I think that procedures and processes and guess what, prejudices that everyone brings to a situation has to be taken into account and dealt with very seriously. And it's usually those that go over the line or have a misstep or not adequately monitored or do not follow the procedures, make it bad for all of us that are out here.
Yeah. And one thing I do hope happens as the mayor puts together a search team for the next police chief, I do hope that he seriously takes the advice and includes in that process some of the on the ground community leaders, so that they can hear directly from and know kind of what is important to our communities in a police chief and in a police department.
Yeah, I think it's to the benefit of the mayor, and I think my sense of it is he's not taking it lightly, that's for sure. And I think that this is something that's going to be followed to the end. I guess the question is going to be, what do you end up with? What package do you end up with that's appropriate, that's effective, that's respectful, that wards off or minimizes these kinds of things that are happening going into the future? Yeah. And I think that's going to be very important to do. So I think we all going to ride this one all the way out. I don't think there's any way.
So the wheels fall off.
until I'm sure of that. So I want to thank you so much for sharing your time with us here on Straight Talk. I'm looking forward to talking with you again when you're available, and perhaps some other aspects or some other individuals that are involved in this as well, to better inform the community. I think it's very important for people to know, and I think it's very important for us to take cogent steps to resolve this. This isn't the only problem we have, but this is a major problem that we have, and we must deal with that.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, I do want to raise this issue. Guess what? We're getting ready to head into an election, and make sure you register to vote. The 2020 primary election is quickly approaching here in Kentucky. You know, it's been moved to June 23rd for you to register. You have to register by June 23rd. But guess what? You can still register to vote online until May 26th. You got till May 26th, no later than 4 p.m. now. Yeah, you can go to elect.ky.gov and get all the information that you need. So I want to run this down to you real quick. Once you're registered, Kentuckians have 4 ways to vote. And take this down, be clear, because I know it's confusion to a lot of people. I've gotten a lot of calls. First of all, you can vote by absentee by mail. That is set up. You're going to do that. You can hand deliver your absentee ballot, even at the polls on election day. You can vote early, in person, with an absentee ballot. Or you can vote, as I've indicated, on election day, but in person. So if you plan to choose an in-person option, consider calling your county clerk's office beforehand to make sure they are able to accommodate you. That's very important. Again, you can find information on sos.ky.gov/VIC. Keep in mind, voting is essential. It's essential, and voting in the primary is essential. That primary date is June 23rd. Keep that in mind. If you're going to get that absentee ballot and so forth, you got to get it 7 days before that. And that would be it'll be the 16th of June. The second thing I want to say is we have a general election coming up. I am a strong advocate of voting in primaries, and that's where people do not step up. I never get it, because that's where you select the person. You nominate the term they use, but you select the person that you want to represent you. And it's in the general election, you only have a tee-up of someone that represents both parties and maybe an independent to slip in there. But the major people will be of either the Democratic or Republican Party. So I want to encourage you to vote in primaries as well as you would vote in a general election. It's extremely important that you do so. So again, I want to thank our guest today, Ms. Lonita Baker, attorney extraordinaire. And as well, I want to thank you for viewing Straight Talk. And we look forward to seeing you again on every Saturday at 12 noon on Straight Talk. God bless you, and do the right thing.